Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sleepy Shadows. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and fall asleep. If today was long or heavy, I'll do my best to make your night a little more comfortable with these stories. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy calm, quiet horror stories like these, you're welcome to subscribe. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. I have wanted to tell this story for a long time, but every time I think about it, I feel that same chill run through me. Even now, years later, it still affects me in ways I can't fully explain. This isn't something I ever wanted to believe in, and it's not something I share lightly. But everything I'm about to describe truly happened, and the memories of it live with me every single day. When I was 19 years old, I met a girl who would end up changing my life forever. We fell into a relationship quickly, the way young people often do, without thinking too far ahead. We were in love, or at least we believed we were. Not long after, we had 2 beautiful daughters together. Like many young couples, we struggled. Money was always tight. Stress was constant. We were learning how to be adults while already being parents. My girlfriend was of native background. She had grown up on a reserve but moved into the city to live with me. In 2005, we were renting a small house and trying to make things work for the sake of our kids. Life was difficult, but it felt manageable at the time. That year, her youngest brother came to stay with us for a couple of weeks. His name was Clinton. He was only 16 years old, quiet, respectful, and genuinely a good kid. He helped out around the house, was kind to our daughters, and never caused trouble. There was nothing about him that felt strange or unsettling. Until one night. We were all asleep when I suddenly woke up to a sound coming from the living room. Clinton had been sleeping on the couch. At first, I couldn't quite register what I was hearing. It wasn't a normal noise. It wasn't talking or crying, or it was something else entirely. I got out of bed and walked toward the living room. Clinton was still asleep, but he had sat upright on the couch. His eyes were closed, yet he was making this deep, haunting sound. He was howling, not yelling, not screaming, howling like a wolf. It was low, raw, and primitive in a way I had never heard from a human being before. The sound felt ancient, like it didn't belong in a modern house. I stood there frozen, watching him. After a moment he stopped, slowly lay back down, and continued sleeping like nothing had happened. I didn't wake him. I didn't tell anyone about it at the time. I convinced myself it was just a bad dream, or some kind of night terror. A few days later, Clinton did something that struck me as odd. He invited my girlfriend and me out to dinner. Not just anywhere, but to the Keg, which is an expensive restaurant. I remember thinking how strange it was for a 16-year-old kid to insist on paying for such a meal. He was smiling, calm, almost proud to be treating us. The whole dinner felt off, like there was a weight behind it I couldn't place. The very next morning we woke up and Clinton was gone. At first we assumed he had gone out early or decided to head back to the reserve. Then the phone rang. He had been killed in a car accident on his way back home. I still remember the way the room felt when we got that call. Heavy, silent. My girlfriend collapsed into tears. I didn't know what to say or do. My mind immediately went back to that night in the living room. The howling, the dinner. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he had known. That something in him understood he was leaving, or even if consciously he didn't. At Clinton's funeral, the pain in the family was overwhelming. His older brother, Joe, was completely broken. He cried openly, clung to Clinton's tombstone, and refused to leave. Watching him was heartbreaking. It felt like watching someone unravel. After the funeral, there was a traditional fire held for Clinton. People gathered around, sharing stories and memories. As I sat there, staring into the flames, I looked up at the sky. A single black crow was circling above us, over and over again. What struck me was how alone it was. As far as I could see in any direction, there were no other birds. Just that one black shape moving in slow, endless loops above the fire. About a month later, we were back home when we got another phone call. Joe had been killed in a car accident near the reserve. Or the same way Clinton had died. It didn't feel real. It felt like some horrible echo repeating itself. At Joe's funeral, I watched my girlfriend the way I had watched Joe at Clinton's. She clung to the tombstone, crying, refusing to let go. Again, there was a fire held after the burial, and again I looked up at the sky. This time there were 2 black birds circling the fire. Only 2. Nothing else in the sky. Something inside me shifted at that moment. I didn't say anything, but I knew. I didn't know what it meant exactly, but I knew it wasn't coincidence. A couple of months later, my girlfriend woke up one morning shaken and pale. She told me she had dreamed that our house burned down and that all of us died in the fire. She was already very superstitious and believed that her family was under some kind of curse, but that dream terrified her. She packed up our children and decided to stay at a friend's house for a night or 2, just to be safe. While she was gone, I ran into an old high school friend named Tim. We bonded over music, always had. We decided to hang out at my place and jam for the night. We played music for hours, laughed, drank a little, and eventually he went home. I fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, I went to work like normal. About an hour into my shift, I got a phone call. My house was on fire. I rushed back, and what I saw looked unreal. Police tape everywhere, fire trucks, smoke. The house was completely destroyed, burned down to its bones. There was nothing left. If my girlfriend and children had been there, they would not have survived. There is no doubt in my mind about that. After that, everything fell apart. My girlfriend and I eventually separated. I gained custody of our daughters. She moved back to the reserve to be with her family. Later, I met someone new and eventually remarried. My children lived with me and my new wife and visited their mother on weekends. In December of 2007, my ex-girlfriend called me from the reserve. She was asking about taking the kids for Christmas break. I could hear something in her voice that I had never heard before. It was shaky, heavy, full of sadness. I can't explain it properly, but it felt like a goodbye. An hour later, her sister called me in hysterics. My ex-girlfriend had been killed in a car accident on her way home from work. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was the only one who died in the crash. Telling my daughters that their mother was gone was the hardest thing I have ever done. At her funeral, as I was leaving the reserve, I felt something wash over me. Calm. Acceptance. I knew without thinking that if I looked up, I would see 3 black birds. I looked. There they were. 3 black birds circling above. I knew it was her and her brothers. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Months later, during the trial of the drunk driver who killed her, my new wife and I were talking in bed about a newspaper article. I mentioned how much it bothered me. My wife, without thinking, said something cruel about my ex. The next morning, I walked outside to go to work and stopped dead in my tracks. My car was completely covered in bird droppings. Not a little. Completely. Like dozens of birds had targeted it all at once. There were no trees around, no birds anywhere else. No other cars touched. I knew. Since that time, I have never looked at black birds the same way. To me, they are not just birds anymore. They are reminders, messengers, proof that some things follow us beyond what we can see. All of it connects now, in ways I didn't understand back then. And whether anyone believes it or not, I know what I lived through. When this happened, I was very young, probably around 7 or 8 years old. And at that age, your world is still small. Your bedroom feels like the safest place on earth. Your house feels familiar, and you trust that nothing bad can happen while you're asleep. That night was one of the first times in my life where that sense of safety cracked. And even now, years later, I can remember the fear with uncomfortable clarity. It started out as a completely normal evening. My sister and I were downstairs watching television together. Our parents had already gone to bed, and we were doing what kids always do, trying to squeeze in a bit more time awake before being told to go to sleep. The TV was playing some random show, and the house had that quiet nighttime feeling, where the lights are dim and everything feels slower. For some reason, I had a sleeping bag with me downstairs. I honestly don't remember why. It might have been from a sleepover, or maybe I had dragged it down earlier because I thought it would be fun to sit in. At that age, things like that didn't need a reason. You just did them. The sleeping bag was bright and bulky, and I remember thinking it would be cool to sleep in it instead of under my usual blankets. Eventually, the tiredness caught up with us. My sister yawned and said she was going to bed, and I followed soon after. I rolled up the sleeping bag, carried it upstairs, and walked into my bedroom. Everything looked exactly the same as always. My posters were on the walls, my toys were where I left them, and nothing felt off in any way. I climbed onto my bed, laid the sleeping bag out on top of the mattress, zipped myself inside, and fell asleep pretty quickly. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I suddenly woke up, but it felt abrupt, like being snapped out of a dream. What woke me was the sensation of something hitting the mattress right next to my face. It wasn't touching me directly, but it was close enough that I felt the movement through the bed. The mattress dipped and rebounded slightly, like someone had slapped or punched it. At first, I didn't fully panic. I was still half asleep, and my brain was slow to catch up. I remember lying there with my eyes open, staring into the darkness, trying to understand what had just happened. I listened carefully. The room was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no movement, just the normal sounds of a house at night. I tried to rationalize it, even as a kid. Maybe I had moved suddenly in my sleep. Maybe the sleeping bag shifted. Maybe something fell off the bed. None of those explanations felt quite right, but I was tired. And tired kids are very good at convincing themselves to ignore things. So, after a few seconds, I closed my eyes again and tried to go back to sleep. That didn't last long. The second time it happened, there was no doubt about it. Something hit the mattress again, right next to my face. But this time it was harder. Much harder. The force was stronger, like whatever it was wanted to make sure I was awake. The bed jolted, and I felt it through my whole body. My eyes flew open, and my heart started racing instantly. I wasn't sleepy anymore. I was fully awake and terrified. That deep, instinctive fear hit me. The kind that doesn't come from thinking, but from pure reaction. My chest felt tight, and I remember feeling suddenly very cold. I didn't stay in bed to figure it out. I didn't sit there and listen. I bolted. I jumped out of bed, ran into the hallway, and went straight to my sister's room. I burst in without knocking and started talking all at once, trying to explain what had happened. I told her that something had hit my bed, right next to my face, and that it happened twice. I was probably shaking, my voice probably too loud, but I didn't care. I just didn't want to be alone. At first, she brushed it off. She told me I was probably dreaming or imagining things. She said I was being silly, and that I should just go back to bed. That reaction hurt more than I expected, because it made me feel stupid on top of being scared. But I insisted. I told her I wasn't making it up, that I was really scared, and that I didn't want to go back into my room. I asked if I could sleep in the other bed in her room. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. I think she could tell that I was genuinely frightened. I climbed into the spare bed, pulling the covers up tightly around me. Even though I was still scared, being in her room made me feel a little safer. At least I wasn't alone anymore. The house was quiet again. That deep, heavy nighttime silence settled in. We both lay there, not talking, probably listening more closely than usual to every small sound. I was starting to calm down just a little when it happened. There was a loud bang. It came from my room. It wasn't a soft noise. It wasn't something subtle that you could easily explain away. It was loud enough that we both jumped. My heart felt like it stopped for a second before slamming back into motion. We sat up in our beds, staring at each other in the dark. I didn't have to say anything. The look on her face told me she heard it too. Neither of us went to check right away. The idea of walking back down the hallway toward my room felt unbearable. We stayed where we were, frozen, listening, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. The house went silent again, as if whatever caused the noise was finished. Eventually, we managed to fall asleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I remember waking up several times during the night, convinced I had heard something, only to realize everything was quiet. The next morning, we went to my room together. Walking down the hallway in daylight felt completely different, and the fear from the night before hadn't fully faded, but it was dulled by sunlight and the sense that daytime brings. When we opened the door to my room, my stomach dropped. All of my posters had fallen off the walls. Not one or two, but all of them. They were scattered across the floor. Outside my room, in the hallway, there were bin bags that had been left there, and those had fallen over as well. Nothing else in the house was disturbed, just my room and the area right outside it. I didn't sleep in my room for about a week after that. Even during the day, being in there made me uneasy. At night, it felt impossible. I kept thinking about that moment, lying in bed, feeling the mattress move right next to my face. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to understand what it could have been. My parents tried to explain it away, but they said posters fall sometimes, that maybe the bin bags shifted, that it was probably nothing. I nodded and pretended to accept their explanations, but deep down, they didn't satisfy me. I knew what I felt that night. I knew how real it was. As I got older, I tried to look back on it logically. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, or that my memory exaggerated it over time. But no matter how I approach it, I can't fully explain the feeling of something deliberately hitting the bed, twice, right next to my face. That night changed the way I felt about being alone in the dark. It planted a seed of fear that never completely went away. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes think about it when I'm lying awake at night and the house is quiet. Whatever happened in that room, it was real enough to terrify a child in a way that stayed with them forever. During one summer break, when I was home from college, I took a job that seemed simple and harmless at first. A couple of my friends were already doing it, and it paid just enough to keep gas in my car and food in my fridge. We worked as morning cleaners at the local movie theater. It was one of those big standalone theaters built in the early 1990s, not inside a mall, surrounded by empty land and long stretches of road. There were 12 screening rooms in total, 3 large screens, 4 medium ones, and 5 smaller theaters tucked farther back in the building. Our shift ran from 4 in the morning until 10. That meant waking up when most people were still deep asleep and driving through pitch-black roads to get to work. The theater was about 20 minutes from where I lived, and the drive always felt longer at that hour. And the area around the building was quiet and empty. Before the theater was built, we were told the land had been a mix of wetlands, farmland, and property owned by the local nature center. Even after construction, it still felt isolated, like the building didn't quite belong where it was. The first couple of weeks were completely normal. Boring, even. Usually only 2 or 3 of us worked each shift. Everyone had assigned areas, and you spent most of your time alone, cleaning rows of sticky floors and emptying trash bins while listening to music on your iPod. Sometimes we'd cross paths briefly, nod at each other, maybe complain about spilled soda or broken seats, then go our separate ways again. Occasionally, the day shift would arrive early, and we'd let them know about anything unusual. Broken lights, clogged toilets, or a screen that needed maintenance. One morning, my manager pulled me aside and asked if we had ever noticed the front doors being unlocked when we arrived. I told him no, not that I could remember. He looked uncomfortable, then told me why he asked. Apparently, customers had been complaining, mostly women. They said a tall, skinny man wearing a black suit had been following them from theater to theater. Some claimed he followed them into the bathroom. The descriptions were always similar. Extremely tall, unnaturally thin, wearing an old-fashioned black suit and sometimes a bowler hat. He walked slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. A few customers were so scared they called the police. But when officers arrived, there was never anyone there. The teenage employees on the day shift had given him a name, or as they called him, the Tall Man. I didn't know what to think. At the time, I brushed it off as exaggerated stories, maybe misunderstandings, maybe someone's imagination running wild in a dark theater. I laughed it off, like anyone would. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Out of all the screening rooms, one stood out as different. Theater 5. Nobody liked cleaning Theater 5. People avoided it whenever possible, and if someone had to do it, they complained the entire time. When I first started, I didn't understand why. I was new, naive, and not particularly worried about ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. Theater 5 was located behind the bathrooms in the lobby. To reach it, you had to walk down a long, narrow hallway that led away from everything else. At 4 in the morning, that hallway felt especially isolating. You were far from the rest of the staff, far from the lobby, far from any noise or light. People who cleaned Theater 5 complained about strange things. Nosebleeds, headaches that came out of nowhere, a constant feeling that someone was watching them. Even my boss didn't like going back there, and for some reason, he kept assigning me to clean it. My first strange experience happened on an otherwise normal morning. I had already finished sweeping the lobby and was working my way through Theater 5, picking up cups and popcorn containers before vacuuming. I had my headphones in, music playing, just going through the routine. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing behind me. I kept turning around, expecting to see another worker messing with me, but there was no one there. At one point, I even pulled my headphones out and called out, "Hello?" The empty room swallowed my voice. Nothing answered. I told myself I was just tired. Early mornings mess with your head. I went back to work. About 20 minutes later, I was at the top row, sweeping under the seats, when I heard footsteps. Fast footsteps. Someone running. I looked down toward the front of the theater just in time to see a small, blonde-haired boy dart out of the room and turn into the hallway. I didn't think. I dropped my broom and ran after him. There shouldn't have been any kids in the building at that hour. I chased him down the hallway and into the lobby, heart pounding. but there was no one there. No kid. No movement. My boss was outside near the front entrance, smoking a cigarette. I ran up to him and asked, "Who was that kid?" He looked confused for a second. Then he smiled and laughed, like I had just passed some kind of test. "So you met Charlie," he said casually. Charlie, it turned out, was another regular complaint. Customers swore a little blonde boy ran up and down the aisles during movies, making noise and causing disturbances. Ushers would rush in, only to find no one. Charlie was blamed for tipped trash cans, misplaced supplies, and messes that appeared out of nowhere. He was annoying, not scary, and the staff treated him like an invisible troublemaker. Someone jokingly named him Charlie because he looked like the kid from Willy Wonka. Charlie was always seen in Theater 5. A couple of weeks later, I had my encounter with the tall man. Usually, whoever arrived first in the morning had to go upstairs to the projector level and turn on the lights in all the theaters. The projector area was dark, narrow, and lined with life-size cardboard cutouts of movie characters. In daylight, it was fine. In the dark, it felt unsettling. That morning, I was the first one there. I couldn't find the flashlight we usually used, so I decided to do it without one. I had stayed up all night watching old TV shows, and as I walked down the corridor flipping switches, I found myself quietly whistling the Andy Griffith theme song. Halfway down the hallway, I felt it again, that feeling of being watched. I stopped whistling and stared into the darkness ahead. At first, I thought I was looking at another cardboard cutout. They were everywhere, and in low light, it made sense. I took a step closer, and then it moved. The shape I thought was a cutout straightened from a crouch. It began whistling the same tune I had been whistling, but slower, warped, almost mocking. As it stood up fully, I realized how tall it was, at least 7 feet. I couldn't see details, just a silhouette against exit signs and glowing monitors. It started walking toward me, slowly, calmly, with a slight unevenness in its step, like a limp. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I couldn't move. It took a few steps, then suddenly turned its head, like something else caught its attention. Without a word, it turned and disappeared into one of the offices. That was enough. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, waiting for the rest of the crew to arrive. When I told them what happened, nobody laughed. Nobody questioned me. They just nodded and told me the tall man wouldn't hurt me. I didn't care. I put in my 2 weeks' notice shortly after. To this day, I still think about that theater, about Theater 5, about Charlie, about the tall silhouette whistling back at me in the dark. Some places feel wrong for a reason. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Sleepy Shadows for daily calm horror stories made for late nights and sleep. You can also turn on notifications so you don't miss a new story when the night gets quiet and the shadows return. Now, let's continue. I was about 5 or 6 years old when this happened, and it was my very first sleepover at a friend's house. At that age, everything feels like a big milestone. Staying the night somewhere without your parents feels exciting and grown up, like you're being trusted with something important. I remember being so excited that I barely thought about anything else. I had been to my friend's house many times before, probably more than a dozen, but always during the daytime. In the daylight, the house already felt a little strange, but I didn't have the words to explain it back then. It was just one of those places that felt off in a quiet, uncomfortable way. Still, when you're 5 years old, you don't really question those feelings. You just push them aside and focus on toys, cartoons, and the idea of staying up late. His house was older than mine, with long hallways and rooms that felt bigger than they should have been. Even during the day, some areas felt darker, like the light never fully reached them. There were certain corners where I didn't like standing for too long. and some rooms I avoided without really knowing why. But I figured that was just me being a kid. Kids get scared of dumb things all the time, right? That night, his parents were friendly and welcoming, and everything started out normal. We ate dinner, watched TV, and played with toys in his room. At first, it felt just like any other evening. But as the night went on, and the house grew quieter, something changed. It's hard to explain, especially looking back with adult logic, but the atmosphere shifted. The air started to feel heavy, like it was pressing down on us, when the lights didn't actually dim, but it felt like they did, like the brightness was being swallowed by the shadows. Even the sounds in the house seemed muted, as if the walls were absorbing everything. We were sitting on the floor of his room when I first noticed it. I had this strange feeling in my stomach. The kind you get when you know something is wrong, but don't know what. It felt like we weren't alone anymore, even though there was no one else in the room. I remember looking around, expecting to see something obvious, but everything looked the same. Still, that feeling wouldn't go away. I finally asked him what was going on. I didn't know how else to phrase it. I just said something like, "Do you feel that?" I expected him to laugh at me or tell me I was being silly. Instead, he got really quiet. He looked around his room, and then at the door, and then back at me. What he said next is burned into my memory. "I don't know," he said. "This doesn't feel like the one that's usually here." Even at 5 years old, I knew that wasn't something I wanted to hear. My heart started pounding, and I remember feeling a wave of fear rush through me. Usually here? That meant this wasn't new to him. That meant something was always there, and whatever was happening that night was different. Worse. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I understood enough to know I was scared. From that moment on, things only got worse. The feeling of being watched became stronger, like eyes were on us from every corner of the room. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting it to open on its own. We tried to distract ourselves by talking or playing, but neither of us could focus, and every small noise made us jump. The house creaked in a way that didn't sound normal, like footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. Eventually, we decided that staying in his room was a bad idea. It felt too exposed, too far away from anyone who could help us. We agreed that sleeping in his parents' room would be safer. They were adults, and adults were supposed to make scary things go away. Even though it was embarrassing to admit we were scared, fear won out. To get to his parents' room, we had to walk through the kitchen. The kitchen itself wasn't that big, but it always felt colder than the rest of the house. The door to the basement was there, right along one wall. During the day, it just looked like a normal basement door. At night, it was something else entirely. The darkness beneath it felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Once we walked slowly, sticking close to each other. I remember my friend reaching out and holding my hand, his grip tight and shaky. We tried to be quiet, like making noise would draw attention. Every step felt loud, even though we were barely moving. As soon as we stood in front of the basement door, it happened. The door flew open. Not slowly, not with a creak. It flew open with force, like someone had kicked it from the other side. The sound was loud and violent, echoing through the kitchen. We froze. I don't think either of us even breathed. Time felt like it stopped completely. I don't know how long we stood there, staring into the darkness, but it felt like forever. The basement steps were visible just enough to see that something was there. I still struggled to describe what I saw. It looked like a person, but not really. It was on all fours, like an animal, but its body didn't move the way an animal's should. Its head looked wrong, like it wasn't attached properly, hanging at an angle that made no sense. The shape of it didn't match anything I had ever seen before or since. I remember feeling a cold wave wash over me, starting at my feet and moving upward. My stomach hurt, my chest felt tight, and I wanted to scream but couldn't at first. My brain was trying to make sense of what my eyes were seeing, and it couldn't. That thing did not belong in the world I knew. Then my friend screamed. The sound snapped me out of my frozen state, and I screamed too. We didn't wait to see if it moved. We turned and ran as fast as our little legs could carry us, back to his room. I don't even remember closing the door. I think we just slammed it shut and jumped onto his bed, pulling the blankets over our heads like that would protect us. We stayed there the rest of the night. We didn't go to his parents' room. We didn't move. We just lay there, shaking and listening to every sound the house made. I don't think either of us slept. When morning finally came and sunlight filled the room, the fear didn't disappear right away. It slowly faded, like a bad dream, but the memory stayed sharp. For a long time after that, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination. Kids have wild imaginations, and fear can make you see things that aren't there. But here's the thing. My friend remembers it too. Almost 15 years later, we talked about it again, and he described the same thing I remember. The same basement door, the same shape on the stairs, and the same fear. That's how I know it wasn't a nightmare. Even now, thinking about that night makes my skin crawl. I don't know what was in that basement, and I don't want to. Some experiences stick with you forever, especially the ones you can't explain. That was the night I learned that some houses hold things they don't want you to see, and sometimes they don't care whether you're ready or not. This story happened long before I was born, back when my dad was still a teenager. He's told it to me a few times over the years, always in a serious tone, and every single time he brings it up, he ends the story with the same warning. Never mess with Ouija boards. He doesn't joke about it, doesn't exaggerate, and doesn't try to scare people for fun. In fact, my dad is usually pretty practical and down to earth. That's what makes this story stick with me. Whatever really happened back then left such a deep mark on him that even decades later, he avoids anything related to spirit boards like they're genuinely dangerous. My dad grew up in a huge city, the kind where neighborhoods blur into one another, and not every area feels safe. The neighborhood he lived in wasn't great. There was a lot of noise, a lot of tension, and not many places for kids to go and feel calm. Because of that, my dad and his friends spent a lot of time just wandering around, looking for places where they could be alone and feel separate from everything else. Eventually, they found that place in a large cemetery not too far from their school. It sounds strange, but to them, the cemetery felt peaceful. It was quiet compared to the streets they lived on, and during the day, it was mostly empty. My dad used to say that it felt like stepping into a different world. The noise faded away, and all that was left was silence, trees, old headstones, and the feeling that time moved slower there. My dad had 2 close friends back then. For the sake of the story, I'll call them Jake and Kyle. The 3 of them were inseparable. They went to the same school, took the same routes home, and spent most afternoons together. Kyle was usually the one with the car, so he drove them around when he could. Jake was more adventurous, always pushing ideas that were a little reckless. My dad, from what he's told me, was usually the one who went along with things but didn't really believe in them. That's how they ended up experimenting with seances and spirit communication. It wasn't because they were deeply spiritual or trying to summon something dangerous. It was boredom, curiosity, and teenage stupidity mixed together. They had watched movies, heard rumors, and thought it would be funny or creepy to try contacting spirits in a graveyard. Most of the time, nothing happened. They would sit there, ask questions, laugh, and then leave when it got dark. There was one specific spot in the cemetery they always went to. It was tucked away from the main paths, surrounded by older graves and trees. It felt hidden, like a secret that belonged only to them. On their way home from school, they would sometimes stop there just to hang out, talk, and escape reality for a bit. It became their routine. One evening, Kyle suggested they bring a Ouija board. He had managed to get one from somewhere, and the idea excited Jake immediately. My dad wasn't thrilled, but he didn't argue much. To him, it was just a board with letters on it. He didn't believe it could actually do anything. They sat down in their usual spot as the sun started to set. The air was still, and the cemetery felt heavier than usual, though my dad didn't think much of it at the time. They placed the board between them, rested their fingers on the planchette, and started asking questions. At first, it was harmless stuff. Names, random words, things that made them laugh. Then Jake, half joking and half curious, asked a question that should never have been asked. He asked when he was going to die. According to my dad, the planchette moved slowly, almost dragging itself across the board. None of them spoke as it spelled out the answer. 1 week. The mood changed instantly. The laughter stopped. For a moment, none of them said anything. Then Jake laughed it off, saying it was stupid, and that they were obviously moving it themselves. Kyle agreed, and made a joke about how they'd all still be there next week, laughing about it. My dad felt uneasy, but he didn't say anything. They packed up the board and left shortly after. Life went on as usual. School, hanging out, walking home, nothing out of the ordinary. As the days passed, the Ouija board incident slowly faded into the background. By the time a week had almost passed, my dad barely thought about it anymore. Then, exactly about a week later, everything fell apart. After school one afternoon, my dad took his usual route toward the cemetery, expecting to see Jake and Kyle there. As he got closer to their usual spot, he saw Jake standing alone. Even from a distance, something looked wrong. Jake was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair, clearly panicked. My dad ran up to him and asked what was going on. Jake was breathing heavily and looked terrified. He told my dad that Kyle had been in a bad car accident. He said it happened on the way home, that the crash was serious, and that he thought Kyle might be dead. He begged my dad to run to Kyle's house and tell his parents. But without stopping to think, my dad took off running. His heart was pounding as he sprinted through the streets, replaying the words 1 week in his head. By the time he reached Kyle's house, he was out of breath and shaking. When he arrived, he saw 2 police cars parked out front. Panic fully set in. He ran inside the house without thinking, yelling that he heard Kyle was hurt and asking where he was. He started explaining that Jake told him about the accident, that Kyle was possibly dead, and that he had just seen Jake waiting in the cemetery. Then he stopped. Kyle was standing right there in the living room. He had some minor bruises and cuts, but he was alive. His parents were there, along with the police officers, all staring at my dad in complete confusion. The room went silent. Kyle asked him, slowly and carefully, who he said he saw in the graveyard. My dad repeated Jake's name. That's when the truth came out. There had been an accident. Jake had asked Kyle for a ride home that day, something he didn't usually do. On the way, another car hit them. Kyle was injured but survived. Jake, who had taken the full impact of the crash, died at the scene. The realization hit my dad all at once. The Ouija board had never predicted Jake's death for Jake himself. It had predicted it for them. And when my dad thought he saw Jake standing in the cemetery, panicked and alive, that couldn't have been possible. Jake was already dead. My dad doesn't like to talk about what that moment felt like, but he said that the shock and guilt stayed with him for a long time. He questioned everything he had seen and heard. He questioned whether he really saw Jake, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But no matter how hard he tried to explain it away, the timing, the message, and the location never made sense. From that day on, my dad refused to go near Ouija boards. He refused to even be in the same room as one. He believes that whatever they contacted that night wasn't harmless, and that some doors should never be opened. He doesn't claim to understand what really happened. He just knows that something did, and it changed him forever. And every time he tells the story, he looks at whoever is listening and says the same thing, with absolute seriousness. Some things are better left alone. When I was 17 years old, my dad moved into a new house. My parents had been divorced for several years by that point, so moving between homes was already a normal part of my life. My dad had developed a habit over the years of buying run-down houses, the kind most people wouldn't touch, fixing them up piece by piece, and either selling or renting them for much more than they were originally worth. He was good at it. He had patience, a decent eye for structure, and the stubborn belief that almost anything could be fixed with enough work. This house was no different on paper. It was older, needed repairs, and had been sitting on the market for a while. We were told it had belonged to an elderly woman who had passed away, and her family had decided to sell it rather than keep it. At the time, that detail didn't seem important at all. People die in houses all the time. It didn't feel strange or ominous. It just felt like another project. My dad moved in during the winter. The house felt cold in that deep, quiet way older homes often do, especially when they've been empty for a while. On one of the first weekends after he moved in, my two sisters and I stayed over. It wasn't unusual for us to spend weekends there, and none of us thought twice about it. That first night, we all went to bed at our usual times. My sisters shared one room, my dad had his bedroom, and I had my own. I remember lying in bed feeling restless. I couldn't fall asleep easily, and when I did drift off, I kept waking up again. It was one of those nights where sleep never feels deep or solid. Every time I woke up, I heard something. At first, it sounded like muffled voices, not loud enough to understand words, but clear enough to know it was conversation. The best way I can describe it is like a television playing at the lowest possible volume in another room. Just soft murmuring, rising and falling in tone, as if two or more people were quietly talking to each other. I didn't feel scared. I just assumed someone else was awake. I figured my sisters were watching TV, or my dad couldn't sleep and had something on. The sounds weren't aggressive or threatening. They were calm, almost soothing in a strange way. Eventually, I fell asleep for real. The next night, the same thing happened. Again, I woke up and heard the voices. Again, I assumed it was someone else in the house. I didn't bother getting up to check because it felt pointless. The sounds weren't loud, and they didn't feel urgent. They were just there. And this pattern continued over the next few nights we stayed at my dad's place. I didn't think much of it until one morning at breakfast. We were all sitting around the table, eating and half awake, when I casually asked if anyone had been watching TV late at night. Everyone looked at me strangely. My sisters said no. My dad said no too. Then, almost at the same time, they both admitted they had heard noises as well. Each of them had assumed it was one of the others. My sisters thought it was my dad. My dad thought it was us. That was the first moment the situation felt odd. Still, none of us jumped to conclusions. Old houses make noises. Walls carry sound. Heating systems click and hum. We laughed it off and moved on. A few nights later, my dad was home alone. That night, he heard the voices too. This time, he decided to investigate. But he got out of bed and checked every room. No television was on, no radio, no phone, nothing that could explain the sound. He said the house felt empty and quiet once he started moving around, like the noise had vanished as soon as he went looking for it. Over the next few weeks, guests who stayed over mentioned the same thing. They would wake up in the middle of the night and hear quiet whispers, assume it was normal, and go back to sleep. No one ever reported feeling afraid. It was always just confusion. Months passed. Then my dad had surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it required him to stay home and rest for a while. He was recovering slowly, sleeping a lot, and spending long nights awake when sleep wouldn't come. It was during this time that something happened that completely changed how we all looked at that house. One night, around 3 in the morning, my dad woke up suddenly. He said he felt alert immediately, not groggy or disoriented. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized he wasn't alone. Standing next to his bed was a woman. She appeared as a shadowy figure, but clear enough for him to make out her shape and features. She looked old, with a gentle posture and a calm presence. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't angry. She was just there. My dad said she looked at him and spoke softly. "You have a nice family," she said. "Thank you for taking care of my home." Then she turned and walked away. As she moved, she made a sound that immediately reminded him of the whispers we had all been hearing. That same low, gentle murmur, like quiet conversation carried through walls. He didn't chase her. He didn't scream. He didn't move at all. He just lay there, unstunned until she was gone. The next night, the whispers stopped. They never returned. From that moment on, the house felt different. Lighter, somehow. Quieter in a way that felt natural instead of unsettling. No one ever heard the voices again. Later on, while cleaning out the attic, we found a box of old photographs left behind by the previous owners. Inside were pictures of the woman who had lived there before. When my dad saw them, he went silent. She was the woman he had seen. Same face, same posture, same presence. To this day, my dad swears that experience was real. He's never changed his story. He's never exaggerated it. And knowing him, knowing how practical and grounded he usually is, I believe him. That house was never violent, never angry. It just felt occupied. And maybe, once she knew her home was in good hands, she finally let go. Whatever it was, it stopped that night. And that's what stays with me most. I worked as a security lieutenant at a National Guard airfield, a job that came with long hours, a lot of responsibility, and plenty of quiet nights. Most people imagine security work as tense and exciting all the time, but the truth is that it's usually slow, repetitive, and boring, especially at night. That airfield was massive, but once the day crews went home and operations shut down, it became eerily still. You could go hours without seeing another human being. I had been doing that job long enough to be comfortable with the silence. I trusted my training, trusted my routines, and trusted my instincts. Or at least, I thought I did. That particular night was like any other at first. It was around 2 a.m., the time when fatigue starts creeping in, but your senses are still sharp. The airfield itself was across the street from my office, and part of my duties included doing regular patrols through the main drill hall and the connected office areas. This wasn't some small building. It was large, with long hallways, heavy doors, administrative offices, storage rooms, and the drill hall itself, which was basically a huge open space used for formations, training, and ceremonies. I was the only person assigned to that building that night. No drills, no exercises, no maintenance crews. Completely empty. I had already completed most of my patrol without incident. I checked doors, verified locks, walked every hallway, and cleared every room exactly the way I had been trained. Everything was secure. Nothing was out of place. By the time I finished, I felt that familiar sense of routine satisfaction. Another quiet patrol done. I headed toward the front entrance. I'm mentally preparing to log my patrol and move on to the next task. I stepped out the front door, letting it close behind me when I heard it. Footsteps, not shuffling, not creaking, not something settling in the building. Someone sprinting. It was loud, fast, and unmistakable. Heavy boots pounding against the floor, coming from inside the building, down the hallway to my right. The sound was clear as day, echoing through the corridor. My body reacted before my brain fully caught up. Training took over. I spun around, drew my sidearm, and ran back inside. I shouted commands as I moved, loud and authoritative, telling whoever was there to stop and identify themselves. My heart was pounding, but my mind was focused. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about anything paranormal or strange. I was thinking intrusion, unauthorized presence, the potential threat. The hallway stretched ahead of me, long and straight. The sound of running had been moving away from me, towards the far end. At the end of that hallway were a set of heavy double doors that led out into the motor pool. I knew those doors well. They were solid, secured, and locked. You couldn't just slip through them quietly. I reached the end of the hallway in seconds. The doors were closed, locked, no movement, no sound, no sign that anyone had passed through. There was nowhere for a person to go without being seen or heard. I stood there for a moment, weapon raised, listening. Absolute silence. A wave of confusion hit me. That didn't make sense. I knew what I heard. I hadn't imagined it. It was too clear, too physical, too real. I turned around and began moving back down the hallway toward the front entrance, but still holding my weapon at the ready. This time I cleared every office again, one by one. Each door was locked from the outside. Every room was empty. Desks, chairs, filing cabinets, nothing disturbed. No signs of forced entry, no hiding places big enough for a person to disappear into. Still, I didn't relax. I continued my sweep, re-clearing the entire building from end to end. I checked rooms I had already checked earlier that night. Same result. Nothing. No one. The building felt empty, but now it felt different. The silence was heavier, thicker, like it was pressing against my ears. Eventually, I made my way into the main drill hall. The drill hall was enormous, with high ceilings and a wide open floor. Sounds carried strangely in there. Even your own footsteps echoed longer than they should. As I stepped inside, something immediately caught my attention. A freestanding fan was running. It was positioned near one side of the hall, plugged in, oscillating slowly. I knew for a fact that it had not been on earlier. I would have noticed it during my previous patrol. I stood there staring at it, my grip tightening on my weapon. Trying to stay professional and rational, I called out, "Is anybody here?" My voice echoed across the drill hall. The fan stopped. Not gradually. Not like it was losing power or being turned off normally. It stopped instantly, like someone had slammed the brakes on it. The blades didn't slow down. They didn't coast to a halt. They just froze. At the same time, the temperature dropped. And I don't mean a subtle chill. The air in the room suddenly felt cold, sharp, like stepping into a refrigerated space. I could feel it on my skin, creeping up my arms, down my spine. Every hair on my body stood on end. That was the moment something inside me broke. I had been trained for intruders, threats, emergencies. I had dealt with stressful situations before. But this was different. There was no target, no explanation, no logic to lean on. Just an overwhelming sense that I was not alone. And whatever was there did not want me there. Fear washed over me in a way I had never experienced before. Not panic, not adrenaline-fueled urgency, but deep, gut-level dread. The kind that makes your instincts scream at you to leave immediately. I didn't wait. I backed out of the drill hall, lowered my weapon, and moved as fast as I could without outright running. I exited the building and crossed the street back to the main airfield, where my office was located. Once inside, under bright lights with other secured areas around me, I finally felt like I could breathe again. Later that night, trying to make sense of what had happened, I reviewed the security camera footage. I expected to see something. Anything. A shadow. A glitch. Movement. Something that would explain the sounds and the fan. There was nothing. Just footage of me walking through hallways, suddenly turning around, drawing my weapon, running, clearing rooms, and then standing alone in the drill hall before abruptly leaving. Watching it back made me look unhinged, like a security guard losing his mind in an empty building. But I knew what I felt. I knew what I heard. And I will never forget that cold. That sudden, unnatural drop in temperature, paired with the silence and that crushing feeling of being watched. It followed me for days after. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't sleep properly. Every quiet moment brought it back. 2 weeks later, I quit. I didn't give a dramatic explanation. I didn't accuse the building of being haunted. I just said the job wasn't for me anymore. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going back into that building alone at night ever again. Some places hold on to something you can't see, can't explain, and can't fight. And once you feel it, truly feel it, you don't forget it. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just fade away, they stayed with you. Each one was shared to feel real, quiet, and close. Moments that could happen to anyone. Moments where something felt wrong, or nearly did. If you'd like to keep listening to stories that linger long after they're told, consider subscribing to Sleepy Shadows. There are more waiting in the dark, and not all of them disappear by morning. Good night.